I kept a tally while I was doing my research with Muslim American advocacy groups. A tally of how many times I heard a Muslim say something like, Islam is a religion of peace. Muslims are patriotic. Muslim women are not oppressed. Now, of course, these statements, beyond being kind of cliched, don't seem so harmful. But what troubles me, and what inspires me as a scholar, is what statements are not made. What statements are not made because Muslims are caught up in repeating these one-liners, defending themselves, proving their basic humanity. Now, the backdrop to these statements is, of course, one of Islamophobia. And Islamophobia is a term we're all familiar with, increasingly so since the tragic events of September 11th, 2001. Within days of 9/11, Muslims, and those thought to be Muslim, had been victimized in hate crimes, had their homes and places of worship vandalized, and a massive government program of fingerprinting, detaining, and deporting Muslims targeted people who had never had any connection to terrorism. Today, 15 years later, Muslim women in the hijab continue to experience discrimination. Protests erupt when Muslims attempt to build places of worship, and aspiring politicians receive rowdy applause when they call for a ban on Muslim immigrants. But let's look a little closer. It's true, Muslims experience hate crimes and discrimination, but time and again when I was doing research, I was told about mosques receiving gift baskets from church groups. Muslim women in hijab tell me they're approached by strangers who express sympathy and concern. So what does it mean? What does it mean that shortly after 9/11, George W. Bush gave a speech at a mosque in which he said, Muslims make an incredibly valuable contribution to our country? What does it mean that Obama delivered a speech in Cairo in which he represented the shared principles of Islam and the West? What does it mean that a Newsweek magazine cover story called American Dreamers highlighted the success stories of Muslim American professionals? In other words, what does it mean that Islamophobia has been accompanied by an undeniable Islamophilia? Well, I certainly can't give you a complete answer this evening. To do so, I would have to describe the divide and conquer strategies that are central in the creation of race, the ways in which drawing a line between good and bad people of color has been a preoccupation of power since race was invented. But I can leave you with a framework, one that will allow you to be equally critical of Islamophilia, or good Muslim politics, as you hopefully already are of Islamophobia. Now, in my research, I studied Muslim American spokespeople, representatives, and these were a relatively privileged subset of the Muslim American population, and they often said these statistics about just how well US Muslims were doing. They had higher per capita incomes, higher educational levels than the general population, and these statistics were repeated with pride. It was as though they were some kind of credential to be used in defense of US Muslims. But scholars of race ask us to be skeptical of what are called respectability politics. And by respectability politics, I mean when minority populations show us that they're compatible with the existing order of things. When they do this, instead of addressing the inequalities upon which that order is built. Now, the problem with respectability politics is that they've put the focus on the minority population rather than on the conditions that create inequality. So now let's take a moment and think about the difference between what I'll call attitudinal Islamophobia and systemic Islamophobia. By attitudinal Islamophobia, I mean the prejudices, the perceptions that people have about Muslims. This may include believing that Muslim women are oppressed, or that Muslims are inherently violent or extremist. In other words, attitudinal Islamophobia lives in people's hearts and minds. Now, in my research, I found that these Muslim spokespeople were actually pretty active in combating attitudinal Islamophobia. How? Well, they have interfaith dialogues, hijab solidarity days, Islam awareness events, all with the hopes that if people understand Muslims better, Islamophobia will crumble. But when I sat down with members of these organizations, I found that their concerns were deep. They were troubled by their loss of civil liberties post 9/11. They were worried about US military presence in the Muslim world, and they were deeply troubled by what they see as anti-democratic foreign policy practices of powerful Western states. But here's what someone I'll call Lena told me. Lena said, "Most of us do want to be more vocal. We do want to condemn foreign policy. But if we do that, we'll be seen as extremist and un-American. So it will jeopardize our already fragile position as Muslim Americans. No, now is just not the time to speak about it." In other words, Lena and many others I met while doing my research felt that there was a trade-off, that something had to be sacrificed by Muslims in their quest for legitimacy, inclusion, and belonging. Many echoed Lena's sense that Muslim Americans' position was precarious enough to prevent them from engaging earnestly in political critique. I study this issue in depth in my research, and I find that many of these representatives, these spokespeople, feel stuck in the types of demands they can make. They feel they can argue for inclusion, tolerance, and diversity, but not systemic political change. Living at the heart of this global superpower, what some call an empire, they can ask to be incorporated into it, but they can't challenge it. So Islamophilia, showing the US that Muslims are patriotic and hardworking, rests on an assumption that the only reason Islamophobia exists is because of people's perceptions. That if Muslims rep the best possible Muslim American, Islamophobia will crumble. But here's the problem. At its core, Islamophobia is not attitudinal, it's systemic. It's built into our institutions. It's funded by our tax dollars. And no amount of cultural dialogue can begin to change those realities. Now, I teach about inequality, race, and Islamophobia, and I'm often surprised. I'm surprised by how few of my students know about the close relationship the US maintained during the Cold War with the very groups in Afghanistan we now call terrorists. They certainly don't know about the strong ties between the US government and Islamic monarchies. And they don't know about how religious conservatism in Gulf states actually protects powerful Western economic interests. When they're forced to confront these facts, they have a deep compassion for Muslims. Stokely Carmichael said in 1966, "A man is poor for one reason and one reason only, because he does not have money." Well, if Muslim majority countries seem to be in clash with the West, it is for one reason and one reason only. And no amount of understanding the traditions of Ramadan or Islamic dress code will help us understand it. Only understanding power and domination will. So when these Muslim spokespeople spend their energy trying to dismantle attitudinal Islamophobia, they miss one very important fact, that powerful states create the conditions for Islamophobia. We all remember Ahmed Muhammad, the 14-year-old boy in Texas who built a clock and was promptly arrested on suspicion that it was a bomb. Well, we ought to be outraged at the prejudice and discrimination of the ordeal. We might even applaud the White House for inviting the boy to DC to show his invention to the president. But what if we understood his ordeal as part of a deeply militarized school-to-prison pipeline, one in which students of color are routinely suspended, even arrested, for minor disciplinary infractions? Or what if we understood that the invitation came from the very White House that has labeled all adult men combatants in its drone warfare program? So all racialized populations in the US have had to make a choice. Do they want to spend their efforts, their energies, trying to get a seat at the table? Or do they want to sit with some very uncomfortable facts, the ways in which the world enriches itself through stolen land, racial inequality, imperialism? And to ask for a seat at that table is to participate in some deep injustices. So these good Muslim cliches, they're not only exhausting, they're ineffective. They don't do away with anti-Muslim sentiment, they just create room for a good Muslim archetype. Toni Morrison said, "The very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Someone says your head isn't shaped properly, you get scientists working on the fact that it is. Someone says you have no art, no civilization, so you dredge that up. but none of this is necessary. Now, I argue that the best type of understanding will not come from understanding each other's cultures or religions. It will come from understanding the painful histories that we carry. It will not come from Muslims reminding us that they too worship the God of Abraham, or explaining to us why they pray 5 times a day. It will come from a principled decision, a commitment to build a different type of world, a world in which no one has to prove that they too are worthy of being counted as fully human. Thank you.